Now we move to Dr. Linda Erdrich. I got it right. Welcome, and please proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon.
Now you still have to punch that button.
Thank you. Right. I have been asked by the CTIA to appear today to provide my independent assessment of the science related to potential health effects from wireless phones. I'm a senior managing scientist in Exponent's Health Sciences Center. I have 30 years of experience in environmental epidemiology and health risk assessment. I earned a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Oklahoma, and I have a Master of Science in Biostatistics and Epidemiology. Much of my work includes assessing epidemiological research and integrating this information with that from other disciplines for determining whether human exposure can present a hazard to human health. At the Environmental Protection Agency, I evaluated research related to chemical contaminants of air and water. These health evaluations were used to develop standards such as ambient water quality standards, exposure limits. I have prepared evaluations for chemicals, for radio frequency energy, for electric and magnetic fields, and I've published in the peer-reviewed literature. Since 1991, I have been particularly active in updating standards regarding non-ionizing radiation, which includes radio frequency energy like that from wireless phones. I've served on advisory committees to government and regulatory organizations regarding health evaluations of chemicals and of electromagnetic fields. A little bit of background on cellular phones: that mobile phones operate using radio waves. Radio waves, also known as radio frequency energy, is a range on the electromagnetic spectrum that includes broadcast radio, television, and other devices, including cordless phones, baby monitors, radar, and microwave ovens. Visible light is also part of this spectrum, but is at a higher frequency and shorter wavelength than RF. Radio frequency energy is not radiation in the same sense as for high-frequency X-rays, because the energy of RF is lower and unable to change the DNA of cells. There is a standard scientific approach used to determine whether an exposure source, such as radio frequency energy, poses a health risk. This process first requires that all of the published literature be considered, which will include studies that reported effects as well as those that have not. This is the method that I've used for evaluating the radio frequency research and for other assessments throughout my career. In this process, after the literature is compiled, each study is evaluated to assess its strengths and weaknesses, and more emphasis given to studies of better quality because they'll be more reliable. The purpose of this comprehensive review is to be objective. This approach is designed to ensure that reviewers do not single out studies consciously or inadvertently to support a preconceived opinion. As for any health assessment, the relevant research includes many different methods. As we've heard today, this includes laboratory studies in cells, studies in animals, experimental studies of human volunteers, and epidemiological studies in human populations. Each of these approaches has its own specific strength and limitation, and together the studies provide complementary information. And numerous studies using these different approaches have been conducted over the past 50 years regarding RF and health. Several scientific organizations, and these include government agencies as well as professional organizations, have used this procedure to assess the potential for health effects from RF exposure. And some of them have set exposure limits to ensure safety of the public and of workers. These expert groups usually include scientists with different skills to reflect the different research expertise required to answer questions about potential health effects. While the conclusions vary, all of the agency reports that assess the evidence using a comprehensive approach reach similar conclusions: that the current scientific evidence does not demonstrate that wireless phones cause cancer or other health effects. A few examples follow. The agencies that have regulatory authority over radio frequency emissions in the United States are the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And they've both reached similar conclusions. The FCC concluded there's not scientific evidence that proves that wireless usage can lead to cancer or other problems. And the FDA states the weight of scientific evidence has not linked cell phones with health problems. The conclusions of these agencies are similar to conclusions reached by commissions around the world, including, for example, the Health Council of the Netherlands, which published a report in 2008. The European Commission has a committee called the Scientific Committee on Emerging and Newly Identified Health Risks, and they wrote a report on RF. The World Health Organization has an ongoing review process. The Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency has recently posted statements on its website, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety, reviewed this in 2005 and is in the process of updating its review. But the most recent one was in 2009. The International Commission of Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection has reviewed all of the evidence, and one section of its report is an epidemiological study by Dr. Album in 2009. In his summary, he wrote, "In the last few years, the epidemiologic evidence on mobile phone use and risk of brain and other tumors of the head has grown considerably." This is the ICNIRP. "In our opinion, overall, the studies published to date do not demonstrate a raised risk within approximately 10 years of use for any tumor of the brain or any head tumor." Based on my review of the epidemiological studies and consideration of the experimental data, I concur with the conclusions of the scientific organization. The current evidence does not demonstrate that phones cause cancer or other adverse health effects.
Conclude a causal connection. Is that right?
Right. For causal association, the criteria are much more stricter.
Dr. Erdreich, you testified that the evidence does not demonstrate a connection between cell phone and cancer. Now, it is much harder to prove a negative, but what would your answer be? Does the evidence demonstrate that there is no connection between a cell phone and cancer?
You've made an important observation. I think the evidence...
Well, I haven't made an observation. Yeah. I've asked a question.
All right.
I'm not having much luck with answers, but that's my question.
I think the strongest evidence is not any single study. The strongest evidence is that there is a body of research where we've looked at whether certain studies that showed anything can be replicated, whether we've looked at consistency across studies, and where there have been more than 40 animal studies that use different measures to assess the long-term risks. The evidence doesn't come from any single study. The evidence comes from a careful review, looking at the strengths and weaknesses together and putting the data together. This is supported by the fact that the interphone studies, as Dr. Sadetsky states, taken together are kind of strongly not showing an association between use and cancer. So the answer I have to be careful.
Do not strongly suggest a showing between the use and cancer.
It doesn't show.
But that's not a demonstration that there is no connection.
Exactly. What's important is that in the background context of what we know about the nature of the signal, the strength of the signal, how it interacts with cells, there's been research going on with this for over 50 years, although the research in the last 20 years is, of course, used improved methods and is more definitive.
I was once involved in a hearing which had a similar question. The question was, is there evidence that there was no conspiracy on the assassination of President Kennedy? You don't see the connection. The proof of a negative is very, very different from the proof of a positive.
Exactly.
And when you boil it all down, what I hear is not a whole lot of disagreement in this panel. You, Dr. Erdreich, say that there is so little question, in fact, there's no issue of risk at all that you wouldn't take any precaution. I find that...
It's
no, wait a minute, I'm not finished. When I finish and give you a question, I'll pause. But where you end up with all the verbiage, you do not say that the evidence demonstrates there is no connection. Isn't that a fair statement of your testimony?
It is part of that is a fair statement.
Well,
but
which part isn't?
the part that I said there's absolutely no risk whatsoever.
That wasn't part of my question. That was an observation before.
Your statement that it's very hard to prove a negative is really on
Let's
target.
go back to my question. Isn't the fair summary of your testimony that there is the evidence does not demonstrate the absence of any connection between exposure and cancer?
The evidence does not, excuse me, I have to take just the liberty of rephrasing.
No, I'll do that.
Oh, please.
The evidence does not demonstrate that there is no connection between the use of a cell phone and cancer.
You had said the evidence does not demonstrate that there's no connection. Is that what you meant to say? I'm sorry.
I'll repeat it again.
All right.
A fair statement of your testimony is that the evidence does not demonstrate that there is no connection between the use of a cell phone and cancer.
The scientific evidence could never demonstrate a total no connection.
And I take your answer to be correct. Well, let me tell you where I come out, because this hearing's run very long, but it's been, I think, very worthwhile. What comes through to me is that we just don't know what the answer is. Dr. Sadetsky raises a lot of red flags, but she says, well, it's not whether we use cell phones, but how we use them. She's not advocating not using cell phones. And Dr. Davis, who drew almost as much applause as Senator Harkin, made the comment that she's not alarmed, but she's concerned. And the issue of the precautions, I think, comes through to me, with the exception of Dr. Erdreich's testimony, that precautions are worth taking. Certainly more worth taking than the precautions I undertake in not eating sugar or white flour out of concern for feeding into cancer. And that precautions are not a bad idea. They may not be a good idea, but they're not a bad idea. And that the issue of children is something we ought to look at a little more closely because of the sensitivity of that issue. We have a duty to do more by protecting children. The question that I think boils down to what additional studies are necessary, because nobody knows. And a question as to whether the people who sell cell phones ought to be undertaking more studies. That's a harder question. What Senator Harkin and I can have some influence on is the appropriations process, and to some extent suggestions as to what ought to be done. Whether there's enough of a risk here to prompt the telephone companies, to people who provide cell phones, whoever does that is another question, and my recommendation would be that they study the testimony here very carefully, and that more is to follow. And one final question, Dr. Davis, does your invitation to appear at your hearing at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to hear this fellow from overseas extend to everyone?
Absolutely. Well, we will have it available on the web, and people will have to come and register by 7:30 if they want to be in by 8. We have a,
So if it's on the web, we can sleep in?
yes,
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Distinguished panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you.
Thank you, Senator Spector. Let me follow up on another thing. First of all, I know that we don't have jurisdiction over the FDA here, or the FCC.
Now, when has that stopped you, Senator Harkin? I said, when has that stopped you, Senator?
But because of my new chairmanship on another committee, I do have jurisdiction of the FDA. But what I wanted to follow up with is a question that I will pursue beyond this panel with my friends at NIH, and that is this. Dr. Erdrich stated, and I made note of this because it's something that I have wondered about for a long time. He said that RF energy is not radiation in the same sense as used for high-frequency X-rays because the energy of RF is so much lower and is unable to change the DNA of cells. Do you have any definitive proof that this RF energy is unable to change the DNA of cells? Now, Dr. Davis said, a study by Professors Henry Lai and Singh showed that low levels of RF signals could produce strange defects in DNA in 1994. So I've got two different things here, and I said I will pursue this beyond this panel with NIH to see if we have any definitive answer to that. Is DNA harmed by low-level RF frequency? Did you have any further views on that, Dr. Erdrich? I can't hear you.
Thank you. This part of the spectrum is known as non-ionizing radiation because it is not known to cause those changes that we've talked about. There have been mentioned a study. It is not the only study, and the agencies that I've been involved with and that I've read about, that have reviewed the research, have considered all of the studies on this question, and they have not concluded that it's been proven to affect the DNA of cells. And the second part is that the strongest evidence you can get is from humans, but there's difficulties in epidemiology studies and in whole animals. Most agencies and authorities that do evaluate health risk think that these studies in cells are important, but it's quite a stretch to say that what happens in cells can happen in human beings or in animals.
Well, Dr. Sadesky, you had a view on this, and Dr. Lisinski.